Christmas was fast approaching on the island of Sodor, and the locomotives on Thomas's branch line were just as busy as those on the main line. Toby and Percy were flat out handling freight traffic, having to haul quite a few special loads as well as their regular freight traffic. There were lots of extra passengers too, to the point where Daisy had to take extra coaches behind her on her runs. Trouble was the last thing they needed right now. Unfortunately, this opinion wasn't shared by the troublesome trucks. If anything, they were worse than usual. One morning, Percy was trying to pick up some milk tankers from Tidmouth Dairy. "Come on, you!" he called as he tried to pull the tankers. What he didn't know was that overnight the tankers' brakes had frozen on. "Percy's not strong enough," teased the tankers. "Come on!" Percy called as he gave one big heave. With a loud snapping sound, the coupling between Percy and the first tank cars gave way. Before Percy knew what was going on, he was off the tracks and sitting in the snow. He could hear the trucks laughing at him. Thomas quickly arrived with the breakdown train and an angry look on his face. "Don't tell me," he said as the workmen began putting Percy back on the tracks. "It's those trucks again, isn't it?" "I'm afraid so, Thomas," Percy replied. And that wasn't all. Later that day, as Toby was taking a mixed train into Elsbridge Station, the trucks bumped him so that he ran past the platform. The engines knew they couldn't afford to let this behaviour go on. Not now. It was Christmas Eve tomorrow, which is usually the busiest day of the year. "We've got to do something," Toby said, "or tomorrow will be absolute chaos." "Yes," Percy agreed, "but what can we do?" Thomas was about to speak when he heard his driver climb down from his cab. Much to his surprise, he saw that his driver was carrying a couple of suitcases with him. "Are you going on holiday, driver?" he asked. "Not at all, Thomas," his driver replied. "I'm playing Santa Claus in my son's school pageant tonight. This is just my costume and padding." Thomas didn't watch as his driver walked away. Instead, a grin crossed his face. His driver's words had given him an idea. He quickly explained it to Percy and Toby. "You'll have to do it on the first train of the day," Percy pointed out. "Yes," Toby said. "I'll talk to Daisy tomorrow and see if she can take my freight cars." The next morning, Toby was waiting by the signal box at Tidmouth when Daisy backed down with the passenger train. "Daisy," he called, "I don't suppose I could have a word?" Daisy braked to a halt, ready to listen. "Would you be able to take my freight trucks for me this morning?" Toby asked.
"Trucks? Toby, you know how I feel about those things."
Toby briefly outlined Thomas's plan and Daisy brightened up.
"Well, why didn't you say so?"
She replied.
"Of course I will."
Meanwhile, at Elsbridge Station, Thomas was speaking to John, the station master's son. "And do you know what to do, John?" "Yes, I think so, Thomas," John replied. As Thomas puffed out of the station, he hoped that everything would work as he had planned. It was out of his hands now. A short while later, Daisy arrived at Elsbridge Station. She pulled into the platform to see John waiting for her, as she'd been expecting. She was due to leave the freight trucks in the siding next to her, but there was one thing she needed to do first. "Daisy," John asked, "does Santa come for trains as well?"
"We don't really have a Santa,"
Daisy replied, remembering what Toby had told her to say.
"but there is St. Stevenson. He visits trains on Christmas Eve, and his arrival is heralded by the ringing of bells."
"And what does he do, Daisy?" John asked.
"He rewards trains for being good, and punishes those who have been naughty, including trucks."
With that done, she moved away to put the trucks into the siding. Now it was all down to Toby. Once they had been left behind, the trucks couldn't help getting a little worried. They hadn't heard of St. Stevenson before, but they knew that Daisy had never lied to them. Suddenly, the loud ringing of bells sounded out. "Ah! St. Stevenson's coming for us!" the trucks yelled, scared. Toby came alongside a few moments later. He had been coasting into the station, so the first the trucks knew of his presence had been when he'd rung his bells. "You tricked us," the trucks said as Toby came alongside. "And you don't try to trick us?" Toby replied. The trucks looked guilty. "We know you like having a bit of a joke," Toby said, "but today we can't afford it. All I'm asking is that you behave for 24 hours. Can you do that?" All right, the trucks agreed. They didn't want to be scared again. The trucks did behave after that. They behaved so well, in fact, that Toby suspected there could be more trouble brewing. He was right about that, but it wasn't going to come from the trucks. At around 5 o'clock, Toby was taking some trucks down the main line towards Tidmouth. A fierce snowstorm had blanketed the island. The sky was dark and visibility was very limited. Toby couldn't help worrying as he battled through the swirling winds and falling snowflakes. He had seen this type of weather before and knew it had the potential to shut down the railroad. As he pulled into Tidmouth, he could see Thomas and Percy waiting there, both looking very sad. A moment later he found out why, as the station master came out waving a red flag. "There's a snowdrift blocking Henry's tunnel," the station master said. "No trains can get through. The Yuletide Express hasn't come through either," Thomas added. Toby's face fell. That wasn't really an express, but a special train that ran every Christmas Eve, carrying people to their loved ones for the holiday. "We must be able to get the passengers through somehow," Toby said. "If we had Donald or Douglas here, there'd be no problem. They're excellent with snow," Percy observed. "Thomas," Toby said, "how do Donald and Douglas fight the snow? I mean, there must be something they do." Thomas thought back to the time that Donald and Douglas rescued him when he'd got stuck with the missing Christmas tree. "They usually work back to back," he said, "with the truck between their tenders. That way one of them can pull the other one out if they get stuck." "Well, why don't we do that then?" Percy suggested, brightening up. Their drivers agreed. The workmen quickly fitted snowplows, and then Thomas coupled up in front of Toby while Percy backed down from behind. They knew they would need all three of them to work together, as they weren't as strong as Donald and Douglas. As they were about to set off, the station master came running up. "I've just heard from Craven's Gate," he called up to Thomas. "Daisy will be bringing down the passengers who are waiting for the Yuletide Express." "We'll have the line clear for her by then," Thomas replied, and with that they were off. They encountered a few small snowdrifts on the way, which were easily brushed aside with their snowplows. They were making good time, and eventually they reached the snowdrift blocking Henry's tunnel. Not stopping, they rammed into the snowdrift at full speed. Only after Thomas was firmly embedded did they start pulling backwards, using all the strength that they could. Then they rammed it again, knocking it down even further. Barely a moment after they finished, a familiar horn sounded out. Emerging from the fog and snow was Daisy, pushing a snowplow before her. She braked to a halt just in front of Percy.
"Could you free lead me into Knapford?"
she asked. "Of course," Percy replied. "That's what we're here for." Their drivers quickly removed the snowplows from Percy and Daisy, then the diesel rail car buffered up to Percy. Once their brake lines had been connected and tested, the train moved off again. At Knapford Station, Henry and Alfred were waiting. Henry had just rescued Alfred and his train, the Yuletide Express, from the very same snowdrift that the Far-Cry Line engines had dealt with. "And if you fit me with a snowplow, sir, I'd be willing to have another go at that snowdrift," Alfred was saying. "Thank you, Alfred," the Fat Controller said, "but that won't be needed. We have 2 snow fighting experts who should be arriving about now." A moment later, Donald and Douglas puffed alongside. Coupled back to back with the works coach between their tenders, they were ready to tackle the snow. "Did you want to see us about a wee snowdrift, sir?" Donald asked as he came to a stop. "There's nothing wee about it," Alfred said. "That snowdrift is taller than I am. Experts you may be, but I doubt you'd be able to take care of it easily." "Well, we'll have to see about that," Douglas replied, raring to go. The 2 Scottish twins moved off, ready to do their job. As they did so, one of the station staff came running up to the Fat Controller. He exchanged a few words, then the Fat Controller spun around. "Stop! Stop!" he called. Donald and Douglas quickly came to a halt and reversed back to the platform, wondering what was going on. "Is something the matter, sir?" Donald asked. "I've just been told there's another train coming in," the Fat Controller said. "And with the weather like this, I don't want anyone out there." "Another train?" Alfred asked, surprised. Before anyone could reply, the sound of a familiar whistle drifted through the air. "It sounds like Thomas," Henry observed. They could hear the sound of another engine coming down the line, and they stared curiously into the fog, trying to make out exactly who was arriving. Donald's mouth dropped open. "You dinna say!" he exclaimed in disbelief. The strange train emerging from the darkness of the snowstorm was the last thing any of them were expecting. Once the train had stopped, all of the passengers got out and crowded round the engines, thanking them for bringing them in. "Thomas, Percy, Daisy and Toby," the Fat Controller said, "you have shown a great deal of initiative and perseverance tonight, and because of that you have made Christmas for a lot of people. You truly are really useful engines."